Hello everyone, welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson. This is a video introducing Leo Strauss's concept of the three waves of modernity. So let's get started. So first of all, who is Leo Strauss? So he was an important political philosopher of the first part of the 20th century. In fact, he's often cited as being responsible for bringing back the importance of political philosophy as opposed to, let's say, political science. And he attended University of Marburg for his doctorate, influenced by neo-Kantianism, but then I think we could say decisively influenced by some encounters he had there with Martin Heidegger and Husserl. So really bringing about what we could call a phenomenological approach to political philosophy, political phenomenology, so to speak, after that encounter. So he has this concept of three waves of modernity, which I find useful. And when I'm teaching literature or texts within the history of ideas with respect to the last 500 years or so, I find situating them often within these three waves can be useful, whether it's for literature or philosophy, and not just political philosophy. So the first thing to keep in mind is that for Strauss, as for many others, thinking about modernity, this broad period of time from roughly, let's say, 1500 to the present, is about thinking of modernity in relationship to the classical tradition that it's breaking from. Now, what Strauss wants to stress in terms of this departure from the classics is how the classics understood the study of beings or beings in their nature as being directed towards a proper end or telos. So the classics had an understanding of nature and the proper study, proper of the proper study of beings or the proper way in which humans need to live together has to be ascertained through an understanding of our natures and our proper ends. So we won't understand what the just society is unless we understand what is the proper end for humans. We won't understand what a tree is unless we understand what its purpose is. We don't understand the eye unless we understand its purpose for seeing. We can't take let us say, an atomistic approach to these things and try to see them as parts. We need to see them as a whole and as directed towards a proper end. Now, beginning with what he'll call the first wave of modernity, these assumptions about understanding beings as unfolding towards their proper ends will be critiqued beginning in the first wave of modernity. So you can see here on the slide, so some representative thinkers of that classical tradition start with Plato and Aristotle, but go all the way from Augustine and then later the scholastics, Aquinas and others. And Strauss really stresses that this break begins with Machiavelli. For him, the major epochal shifts are shifts in political philosophy. So let's look at Machiavelli and the first wave of modernity. So the entire first wave of modernity builds on Machiavelli, as I said, in political philosophy, but also Bacon, I would say, in natural philosophy, in terms of this thinking of nature as outside of its ends. So the uh, the the one thing to point out, though, is that nature is still the object of study. However, beings are in their nature are no longer studied with the purpose of trying to understand their final causes. And as I note here in the political realm, that opens us up to eventually culminating in the thinking that develops into modern liberal republicanism. So individuals without any common end, they're free to pursue their own ends. So Machiavelli, you see his dates in the top of that slide, has been called the first modern man. He writes The Prince, probably his most famous work, in 1513. And the question of his overall vision, I guess we could sum it up by saying that he wanted to return to the virtues of classical republican government, but realized we need a strong prince to lay the groundwork and wants to educate the future, the Prince of Florence in that regard, and is critical of Christianity as having softened humanity. It now lacks the strength to produce a great leader of a free republican citizenry as we were able to do in the past, so to speak. So Machiavelli begins by attacking the classical political philosophers for trying to secure the ends of humanity, how they ought to live. And he feels that all of those attempts to account for the ends of humanity have been misguided and unrealistic. And for Machiavelli, the notion that humanity has an excellence or a virtue that is proper to it must be abandoned in order to accommodate more modest goals. So chapter 15 of The Prince is a good place to start there. So in this way, we could say that Machiavelli consciously lowers the standards of social action. He lowers the standards such that the actualization of those standards is more possible and more in accordance with that aspect of fortune that can be shaped by human willing. So in doing so, he sets out to destroy the classical and biblical foundations of political philosophy in order to clear the way for a new foundation of modern politics. And in this way, Bacon is again very similar in natural philosophy, clear away the classical biblical foundations for understanding nature so that we can build it on a new new instauration, as he calls it. This is from chapter 25 of The Prince, uh, Machiavelli talking about fortune and how it can be bent. I compare fortune to one of those dangerous rivers that, when they become enraged, flood the plains, destroy trees and buildings, move earth from one place and deposit it in another. But this does not mean that when the river is not in flood, men are unable to take precautions by means of dikes and dams, so that when it rises next time, it will either not overflow its banks, or if it does, its force will not be so uncontrolled or damaging. So fortuna can be shaped within limits by a certain virtue. So this is a new sense of virtue than that described by the classical philosophers. So virtue is no longer considered one's proper end or telos that has been allotted by fate or that's fixed in accordance with one's nature. Virtue is now an active power of self-determination. So that's a bit about Machiavelli, the first wave of modernity. Now let's look at the second wave of modernity. Now, a note here, in Strauss's discussions of the three waves, he does discuss Machiavelli with respect to the first wave. In this, when it comes to the second wave of modernity, he focuses on Rousseau, and I do have another lecture on Rousseau in the second wave of modernity. But in the kind of larger schematic of that philosophical shift, I think looking at Kant and Hegel very quickly is more instructive. So I'd like to turn there. So the second wave of modernity, nature or being is replaced by history as what provides the standard. So within the classical tradition and still within the first wave of modernity, the standard, what we needed to understand was still nature. We still needed to understand the things as they, in their essence, in their enduring essence. With the second wave of modernity beginning around 1780 or so, with Rousseau, with Kant, and then later Hegel, nature is seen as unfolding and having a history, as progressing in various phases of development. It grows, it is organic, and it's tied in this way to romanticism and in literature and the arts. So here, history is understood as having an end. So we have what's often termed historicism, and this notion of history as having an end allows the historicists of this second wave of modernity to still be able to adjudicate against different historical claims, so to speak. So if we're looking at one historical manifestation of a, whether it's a truth claim or a political claim that, let's say, women should not have the right to vote, maybe that was a claim of a society 200 years ago, the historicist would say, well, history has been evolving to an end where universal rights of humanity are recognized. This is, as we'll see, is very Hegelian almost. So from the perspective of the end of history, we can see that this was that previous instantiation of rights as only belonging to men was a limited vision and needed to be completed, needed to be overcome. So in this way, we can adjudicate previous epochs and say, well, this is further from the truth, and others are closer to the truth. And the roots of this thinking, as I say here, lie in Kant and Hegel. So let's look at them quickly. So Kant lived 1724 to 1804, and his works, beginning with this Critique of Pure Reason, 1781, it could really be seen as this starting point of the second wave of modernity, the starting point of romanticism in a lot of ways. So he could be seen as providing a Copernican revolution in thinking. So just as Copernicus had taken the Earth from the center and displaced it to the periphery and said, no, it revolves around the sun, so too Kant reverses the terms between the object and the knowing subject. So and puts the self at the center of the creation of truth, so to speak. So empiricists such as John Locke had held that the objective world impressed its categories on a blank slate of our minds. So for them, the direction was the object out there impressing on the subjective mind. For Kant, however, reverses that. Um, the objects of experience must conform to forms of intuition that are provided by the mind, such as space and time, as well as categories of understanding, such as substance and causality. So here it's really about the mind shaping and giving form to objective experience. So here's an example of his basic categories, his forms of intuition, and then this noumena, the thing in itself that we can never approach in itself. We can only approach it as it arises as phenomena, as structured by these categories and forms of intuition. So our mind is always going to take the object and place it in space and place it in time. And now this doesn't properly belong to the thing in itself, according to Kant. This is given to the thing through our experience of it and our forms of intuitions. So too with quantity and quality. Let's say quantity, let's say threeness. It doesn't belong to any of those things. That quantity, it doesn't belong to that. We impress that upon the things. Same with quality, these types of things. Now, Hegel marries Kantian idealism with historicism. So for Hegel, he takes the basic Kantian insight that we have conceptual schemes which shape the world as it arises. And for Hegel, these conceptual schemes evolve through time and they vary with different epochs. So all ages are manifestations of a progressively unfolding absolute spirit, and each age is a dialectical progression beyond the preceding, overcoming the limitations and contradictions of inherent in the previous one. So with Hegel, we really have the defining, let's say, articulation of the historicist point of departure, the notion that views, beliefs, products, and accepted truths of a given are products of a given era, and they're relative to that era. And um, and this insight has largely shaped many of the key thinkers after him. So Marx is although revolting against Hegel in specifics, still understanding truth as evolving over time and being relative to a particular era. Friedrich Nietzsche, Heidegger, Derrida, the postmodernist, he's all of these three also are following in Hegel's wake in believing that there are historical unfoldings of the understandings of truth of how things are. We'll see with Nietzsche, Heidegger, Derrida, they're into this third wave of modernity, so his history has actually been radicalized even further. So another point here on Hegel. So we could say one sentence that kind of sums up what he's all about is history is this dialectical process whereby the spirit comes to know itself and realizes its idea. And dialectical refers to this logical relation, which is, Hegelians hate this because he never says this, but it's a good way to understand it. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, as in the case of a family, civic society, and state. So each could be posited as the ultimate solution for living together. Oh yeah, family is the ultimate attachment to other individuals. And then, oh no, that needs to be supplanted in the next historical development by civic society. And then we could have a synthesis of those in the modern state. So the realization of the spirit throughout history is historical, it unfolds through time, but it has an end or telos. So it's a rational process with a goal. And the realization of this goal is the realization of the essence of freedom in the form of the modern liberal state, according to Hegel. Now, I won't talk about Marx very much, but he, as I mentioned, agrees with Hegel that history unfolds dialectically to a goal, but the goal for him is the communist state, not the liberal states. So let's turn finally to Nietzsche and the third wave of modernity. So, as I said, for Strauss, he looks at Machiavelli in the first wave. Strauss looks at Rousseau for the second wave. We didn't talk about Rousseau. We could have, but we can see the same kind of focus on history. History is having a goal in Kant and Hegel. And now the third wave of modernity, we see Nietzsche as the founding philosopher of that, and Strauss does look at Nietzsche. I will say in the background of his discussion of the third wave of modernity is Heidegger. Heidegger looms there like a specter. He doesn't name him. He's in some cases, sometimes he subtly alludes to him. Now, with the third wave of modernity, the tenets of historicism, i.e., that things unfold historically, that there's no enduring stable truth, are still held, but the end of history is discarded. So there's no rational process to history. There's just different perspectives, different historical epochs asserting their claim, none more legitimate than the other. So if we look at Nietzsche, and you can see his dates here, 1844 to 1900, Nietzsche critiques historicism of Hegel and others and says, history doesn't have a goal. And contra liberalism, socialism, or the state as the goal, he sees that the state as the coldest of all cold monsters. I have a video on Nietzsche's critique of liberalism that could be useful in this context. So he still asserts this historical unfolding of notions of truth and value, but it's not a rational process, does not have a goal. So Strauss calls this radical historicism. So Nietzsche also critiques the notion that we can have knowledge for its own sake. So we fool ourselves into thinking we can have disinterested knowledge, but it's always uh, that we can have a disinterested stance. For Nietzsche, knowledge and truth are inventions of nature in its evolutionary unfolding that have as their goal the advancement of a species. So it's not this kind of objective knowing. And a good articulation of this I always find very kind of memorable are the opening lines of this essay on truth and lies in a non-moral sense. He says, once upon a time, in some out of the way corner of that universe, which is dispersed into numberless twinkling solar systems, there was a star upon which clever beasts invented knowing. That was the most arrogant and mendacious minute of world history. Nevertheless, it was only a minute. After nature had drawn a few breaths, the star cooled and congealed, and the clever beasts had to die. One might invent such a fable, and yet he still would not have adequately illustrated how miserable, how shadowy and transient, how aimless and arbitrary the human intellect looks within nature. So I think, as I said, a very memorable statement of how what we think of as grasping these eternal truths of the cosmos with our knowing are these kind of fleeting perceptions of like a beetle on a dunghill, or even smaller than that in this a speck of dust in the vast cosmos in its unfolding. So according to certain interpretations of Nietzsche, there is a truth. This is questionable. But even if we take that point of departure that Nietzsche believes there is a truth, he asserts that we need to take a perspective on it. We need to know it in such a way that it's bent to the purposes of life. So, for instance, this is my example. We could say it's technically true that what we experience as love is merely, biochemical processes of signal and response. But this would be to take that as our only point of departure would be destructive for the individual and the species. So there can be perspectives that are life enhancing or life denying. And this is from a relatively early essay from about 1874 called On Truth and Lie, and on the uses and disadvantages of history for life. He says, if by contrast the doctrines of the sovereign becoming, of the fluidity of all ideas, types, and styles, of the lack of all cardinal differences between man and animal, doctrines which I consider true but deadly, are still foisted on the people for another generation with the frenzy of instruction which is now customary, then perhaps systems of individual egotism, alliances for the systematic larcenous exploitation of those non-members of the alliance, and similar creations of utilitarian nastiness will step forward onto the future scene. So there's perspectives which are true, maybe, but they're deadly. And maybe too much of truth can be deadly for a species or an individual. And maybe with the history of science, that's what's happened. With the history of modernity, that's what's happened. And we've reached this crisis of nihilism, according to Nietzsche. And he famously sums up this kind of crisis of modern nihilism with the line, God is dead, in The Gay Science, section 125. And there we discover that humanity killed God out of this scientific will to truth. And the death of God leaves humanity and the earth, beings as a whole, without direction or a center of gravity, and that humanity is not ready to hear these words of the one who would expose them. So this, in section 125, Nietzsche has this madman come out to the marketplace with a lantern in the middle of the day to utter these words. And worth looking at it a bit here. I don't have the whole section here. It's worth looking at the whole section. So I invite you to turn to this. Nietzsche's such a great writer. So he's the section 125, the madman. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, I seek God, I seek God. As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. Has he got lost? Asked one. Did he lose his way like a child? Asked another. Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage? Emigrated? Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. Whither is God? He cried. I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? That what were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually? and backwards, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? That's the sense of we have no direction now. So the death of God is also the death of Platonic notions of truth, notions of essence, notions that things have a foundation. So without that notion that there is a truth, without without some sort of anchor for these things, we are without direction. Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we not hear nothing of as yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? God's too decomposed. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. So this, as I said, a fundamental statement of nihilism, and basically where we arrive in this third wave of modernity, this point of radical historicism, which is a radical relativism and a nihilism. Now, in response to the death of God, as uttered by Nietzsche, and post-Nietzsche, Nietzsche is really this figure that has affected so many people in the 20th, 21st century, and is really this kind of landmark that people have to get around. People agree with the diagnosis and they have to figure, okay, but what do we do now? If this is true, what's next? I think I would categorize three basic responses that you can see in serious thinkers that are trying to wrestle with Nietzsche. So one would be to, in some ways, what Heidegger calls step back, return to the ancients and try to rethink the beginning. So are there possibilities for thinking of truth and being that can be rediscovered there, to step back and we can't return to the way people lived and thought in ancient Greece, but can we be inspired for other possibilities? So that would be Heidegger. Strauss, similarly, can we make some sort of return in the sense of a classical possibilities for rational political philosophy? Now, I think the response to this kind of the fragmentation that's left by the death of God, another response would be various forms of totalitarian ideologies. So both of the extreme left wing and the extreme right wing, whether it's communism or fascism. And they involve the conscious creation of new myths. Let's create a new identity in the wake of the loss of all identity, the wake of the loss of all anchors of truth. Let's create a new myth. And it involves usually the subsuming of individual identities into, let's say, a larger class consciousness. So that's socialism and communism, or a national identity for fascism, or a racial or gender identity for today's radical identity politics. So all of these are ways of trying to create a new myth, a new totalitarian ideology to to give something, give an individual an anchor, I guess, as they have been left adrift in the death of God without any direction. And I think the third approach is the embracing of nihilism, I would call it. So you see this in existentialism, Sartre, Camus. You see this in postmodernism of Deleuze, Foucault, Derrida, post-humanism, so embracing the fact that humans are becoming part cyborg, part overtaken by AI. So in various ways, you have figures such as Donna Haraway and Catherine Hales doing that. So just to return to this slide to provide the summary. So as we can see, the classical tradition had begun with a understanding of nature as the standard. Nature is enduring. It's the nature of humanity endures from epoch to epoch. Nature and human nature has a purpose. It's Aristotle. It's to say to develop one's theoretical contemplative life and to try to behold the cosmos. If you're a Christian within that classical tradition, the telos of man is reconsidered in terms of aligning one's will and and aligning one's intellect with God. So that's the classical tradition, understanding nature and understanding nature as having an end or telos. And then the first wave of modernity, as we said with Machiavelli, but we could also highlight these other figures, Bacon, Descartes, Hobbes, Locke, well as others in terms of thinking. Being or nature is still the standard, but it's not, there's no attempt to understand the telos of the beings within nature. Nature, in that way, they can be given and impressed the ends that humans may want to put on them. So within that first wave of modernity, it's good to, let's say, understand that as the context within which, let's say, Shakespeare's writing, other authors of the Renaissance, other authors of the neoclassical period, so of the Restoration and 18th century in English literature. And then in the second wave of modernity, as we saw in Kant and Hegel, nature or being is replaced by history as what provides the standard. However, history has a telos. So we have historicism, history as having an end, and that's how we judge various epochs. And then finally, the third wave, we discussed Nietzsche, and you also see it in Heidegger and Derrida, a radical historicism, so history without a telos. I hope that has been useful introduction to Leo Strauss's concept of the three waves of modernity and a good way of providing some sort of historical framework around various periods of the modern era. Thank you very much.